All right. Hey, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Mike Smulligan. I'm a forester with the Michigan Department of Natural Resources. I also serve as the program chair for the Michigan Society of American Foresters, which is hosting this webinar series on white oak. And as you can see here on this slide, this is the fifth of our 5 webinars that we've had the last few months. It's been a lot of fun. We've had some great speakers, a lot of fun questions. And I'm looking forward to our 2 speakers this afternoon, Ryan Boyer with the National Wild Turkey Federation and Michael Paling with the American Bird Conservancy. And thanks everyone for joining us this afternoon. Got a couple of introductory slides here to give people a chance to jump on the webinar before I turn over the reins to Ryan. So a little bit about the White Oak Initiative. This is a national initiative here in the eastern United States and southeast, northeast, central area, where for the last 5 years or so, the American Forest Foundation has led a large team of people that are very interested in white oak. And this project has been funded by the USDA Forest Service through some landscape scale restoration grants. So thank you, Forest Service, for the funding. And there's a huge group of partners that are interested in white oak here in the eastern and central United States. Other state agencies, the universities, forest products companies, landowners, foresters, loggers. White oak is a preferred species of many landowners. And so we're trying to learn more about white oak and how we can maintain white oak in the landscape here in Michigan and the central and eastern US. Got a little highlight there in yellow where partners at the University of Kentucky have developed some really cool landowner guides. I've got a little hard copy here, and we're printing off a bunch of hard copies that we're going to be distributing to foresters, landowners, and loggers here in Michigan. For those of you outside of Michigan, you can get a PDF of this landowner for oaks series at the White Oak Initiative website there. But those of you that are foresters here in Michigan, be looking for a whole bunch of these to be at the Spring Society of American Foresters meeting in Grayling on March 30. Or if you'd like, I can mail you some hard copies. So here in Michigan, we've got a small team working on White Oak Initiative here. You can see there's a variety of partners there, a couple of state agencies, Michigan State, some land conservancies, wildlife organizations. Thank you everyone for your contributions here to working on the White Oak Initiative here in Michigan. And again, thanks to the Forest Service and the American Forest Foundation for the funds to do some of the work here in Michigan. So as I said earlier, this webinar is hosted by the Michigan Society of American Foresters, which has been around for 120 some years as the professional society for foresters. And we're excited to have foresters participate for professional networking, for continuing education, and for service to society, and to improving our profession and trying to have bigger impacts than we can do on our own. And so thank you very much to those who are members of the Michigan Society of American Foresters. If you're here as a Michigan SAF member, you should be anticipating getting a free copy of the Managing Oak Forests in the Eastern United States. That's one of the things that the White Oak Initiative is funding for foresters here in Michigan. If you're a SAF member, I'm going to ship you one of those books later this week. And or you can get a copy at the Spring Society of American Foresters meeting in Grayling on March 30. And if you are not a member of Michigan Society of American Foresters, we would love to have you join the Michigan Society of American Foresters. And regardless, everyone who's participating today is going to be getting 1.5 continuing forestry education credits. You don't need to do anything else. I'm going to be submitting the attendance records from this Zoom webinar directly to the Society of American Foresters. So if you're looking for 1.5 CFEs, you'll be able to, that'll be credited to your account, and I'll take care of that later this week. We are recording this webinar, and you can find the link to that recording at michigansaf.org. And we're also making these videos available. We have a new YouTube channel for Michigan SAF. So this video, this webinar is recorded, and we'll make that available there. So just a little bit of data on white oak in Michigan. As a forester, I like looking at some of the data. And so I got these data and this text from Scott Pugh with the Forest Service Forest Inventory and Analysis. And as Scott and others are looking at inventory data here in Michigan, the number of mature white oak are holding steady in the landscape. But what we're seeing is a bottleneck in oak reproduction. And it's not so much at the seedling stage, it's more at the seedlings recruiting into the saplings and then not moving on to the pole size. So we're having good regeneration, from acorns, but a lot of those little seedlings are not growing up into the sapling phase, and even fewer saplings are being recruited into the larger size. And so this is not necessarily a problem at the moment, but as foresters, we need to be looking decades into the future. And if we want to maintain the amount of oak in the landscape, this is why others around the country are seeing similar trends in their states, and why collectively the White Oak Initiative is having conversations like this all across the eastern US about what can we be doing to manage white oak, to maintain oak in the landscape. So without any further introduction from me, I'm going to stop my sharing and turn off my camera. And we're going to pass it over to Ryan Boyer with the National Wild Turkey Federation. And Ryan, please take it away, and look forward to hearing what you've got.
Thanks, Mike. I appreciate it. Let me just get it to speed. Transition here.
Perfect. You're all set. It's in full presentation mode and looks and sounds good. Thanks, Ryan.
Excellent. Well, thanks, Mike. I appreciate the introduction, and appreciate the opportunity to be able to participate in this webinar and this collective effort amongst vested groups that care about white oaks and our oak ecosystems, and some of the challenges we all collectively face with our various roles in conservation and what we hope to be able to learn. So I appreciate the opportunity to participate in these types of events, as well as to be able to garner information from other experts. So I was really looking forward to this discussion here today with all of you that are participating, and those that hopefully will have an opportunity to take a look at these and the webinars that were recorded prior to this event. So Mike and I had originally talked about the idea of making this presentation as broad as managing for wildlife species, and then we talked about specific to game birds or game species, and then game birds, and then really thought that there was so much information that could be covered that perhaps it's best to refine the presentation to talk a little bit more specifically about how myself and some of my counterparts work with our partners across the landscape, especially the eastern United States, for managing our oak ecosystems for the benefit of wild turkeys. So I'm Ryan Boyer. I'm the district biologist for the National Wild Turkey Federation, and I cover Michigan, Indiana, and Ohio within my district. And my primary responsibilities are to help develop our conservation programs and assist with the delivery of that work. And so we do that through a number of ways. Primarily through facilitating grants and agreements, and working with our grassroots aspect of our organization. And just, I'd be remiss if I didn't talk a little bit about our organization at the start of this presentation, for those of you that might be on this webinar and perhaps not familiar with the National Wild Turkey Federation and what we do. So we're a 501c3 nonprofit science-based conservation organization. We were founded in 1973, and we are actually in our golden anniversary this year for our 50th anniversary that we just got done celebrating down at our national convention in Nashville. But we're grassroots based, so the importance of our volunteers to facilitate our fundraising, to really help drive the mission of the organization, is critical to our success. And they play a role at all of our levels, at a national level, at a state level, and at a very local level within each of our states where we deliver on our conservation mission. And as you can see by this slide, our mission of the National Wild Turkey Federation is twofold. It's dedicated to the conservation of the wild turkey, but also emphasizes the importance of the preservation of our hunting heritage. and especially as that relates to our conservation funding models in North America and the important role that that plays for helping fund a lot of the habitat work that we can help support collectively, working with our partners on the landscape for the betterment of wild turkey and other wildlife species that benefit. So with that, I want to start somewhat broadly and shift into the importance of oak species. As many of you come from varying backgrounds and are probably far more familiar with some of these aspects that I plan to touch on here initially. But I thought that this illustration of the importance of the white oak, for instance, was really well done. It encapsulates, the importance of white oaks specifically in terms of the wildlife impacts that white oaks can have from a wide variety and array of species, from our insects and pollinators to small mammalian species, large mammals, and game bird species. And our oak forests are one of our largest and most diverse temperate forest ecosystems on the planet. The importance of the mass production through acorns provides an important food source for over 100 wildlife species in the United States. And the role that the acorn plays is critically important for building fat reserves in the fall and winter months for a lot of species, and has been tied to the reproductive success of several different wildlife species, for instance. But beyond just the acorn, the leaves and the buds from oak species also provide important browse for certain wildlife species, as well as cover. So thinking about providing the different aspects based on wildlife needs, white oaks can really play an important role for varying parts of the annual cycle for a lot of wildlife species and very popular wildlife species, and most notably game species. So, but one species not often thought about in terms of the importance of oaks is lepidopterans, your butterfly species that rely on oaks to meet some of their life cycle needs and requirements. So when thinking about pollinator habitat, perhaps oak forest isn't the first thing that maybe initially comes to mind, but oak forests certainly play a role. And then shifting into, building upon what Mike had shared previously with regards to some of the challenges that we're seeing with our oak forests, and this transition of our oak hickory dominated forests moving into primarily being comprised of more shade tolerant species like red maple. So mesophication, it's one of the greatest challenges we're facing across the eastern United States. And we're seeing a lack of regeneration of oaks in the understory, as you can see from this figure that I've provided from FIA data in Ohio, similar to parts throughout the entire eastern United States. And so thinking about oaks in terms of not being a climax forest species, but a mid-successional species, meaning they rely on that disturbance component in order to ensure that they can be managed and sustained and promote some of that response. So with a lack of disturbance over time and active management, we've seen some of this transition take place. And this shift from our oak hickory dominated forest ecosystem types to more maple beech creates a challenge from a number of fronts. From a timber value, oak is an important economic driver from that perspective, but it also reduces the quality and the value of these forests for our wildlife species. But the good news is that science-based active forest management and professionals, certified foresters and wildlife biologists collectively can help offset these challenges by employing management practices that incorporate the necessary disturbance. So with that, let's talk oaks. Very broadly, oaks can be split into two categories: your red oak species and your white oak species. And there's some notable differences between the two in terms of flowering and acorn production, as well as preference for wildlife species. Red oak species, for instance, produce acorns from flowers that are bloomed during the spring of the previous year. Some of the red oak species specifically that I'm referring to in this talk for our areas could include northern red oak, black oak, scarlet oak, southern red oak, and pin oak. But specific to the acorns, red oak acorns generally contain more fat content but are often higher in tannins. So some of that bitter taste associated with red oak acorns make them a little less palatable for certain wildlife species. With your red oaks producing acorns every 2 to 5 years, and generally start producing on most sites on average around 20 years old, and can continue to produce to upwards of 200 years. Where white oak species, acorns develop from flowers that are bloomed on that tree in the spring of the same year, and acorns are more highly palatable for wildlife due to the reduction in tannins when compared. So some of the white oak species we're referring to specifically include chestnut oak, post oak, chinkapin, bur oak, and of course the white oak. And often start producing acorns as well at 20 plus years on 4 to 10 year intervals. So I wanted to have just one slide in here to really kind of emphasize the importance of oaks for some of our more popular game species. And you'll see some similarities and some overlaps regarding the impacts that mass production with oaks can have, especially on certain reproductive rates, as well as the size of the home ranges occupied by these individuals. And there's a lot of literature and research out there that outlines the impacts of mass production, especially thinking about it from like black bears, for instance. It's a critical source to help with fat storage and energy within the fall months, and it's tied closely to reproductive success in the following year. Movement patterns for black bears, ruffed grouse, for instance, have shown to increase as much as 4 times in years where we've got limiting production and poor mast crops. And so, from a food aspect, of course, these oak species are critically important, but also thinking about it in terms of other vital annual needs for these wildlife species. Thinking about cavities for cavity nesting birds, or den sites for bears, for instance. There's also a parasitic plant in the Appalachian mountain regions that called squaw root that's critical food source for black bears in those regions. And you can go on down the list, the importance of small mammals, and due to their caching tendencies, like squirrels, for instance, to help and aid with the regeneration of oak species, essentially planting them in some areas are a primary driver to help promote regeneration of oaks in some of those areas. And think about it from the perspective of certain bat species. The fact that oaks will retain some of their leaves on certain species longer can act as roost sites. And so those leaves could also serve as nesting habitat for other individual species. So there's a gamut of game species and non-game species that really rely on just about every aspect of oaks at different stages to meet some of their life cycle needs. So they really are imperative when we're talking about wildlife in general. But with that, I wanted to shift to the wild turkey. It's our focal species, of course. It's National Wild Turkey Federation, and oaks and wild turkeys go hand in glove. Oaks provide that critical food source for wild turkeys, help aid in winter survival in some of the northern ranges for wild turkeys, and can be tied to reproductive success as well. The idea that those acorns will help build up those important fat reserves during those winter months, and ultimately help put those birds into better condition during the breeding season to help increase the probability or the likelihood of producing a successful nest and brood thereafter. But it's an important consideration, a thing to consider when looking specifically at managing oak forests or oak habitats, ecosystems for wild turkeys, that the use of our oak forests and oak ecosystems by wild turkeys is going to shift depending on the seasonality and based on their resource needs. But general rule of thumb to shoot for in terms of oak management, oak forest, is to have roughly 50% of your management unit area, your stand, producing hard mass diversity of oak species greater than 50 years old on those stands. So kind of shooting for that 50% threshold is a very general recommendation that we look to. But again, you have to think about the role that oak forests play and the adjacency to other habitat types based on the annual cycle for wild turkeys and how those needs shift. And so, again, to reemphasize the importance of that mass production in the fall, aids with winter condition, help them place them into better condition moving into the breeding season in the spring and summer months. So think about that in relation to setting management goals and objectives depending on your role as a manager, as a forester, if you're working with a private landowners, or you're in the process of trying to consider managing for wild turkeys on a public land tract, for instance. And so it's also an important consideration to take into mind that the home range or average home range size for wild turkeys in the eastern United States can vary pretty significantly. And again, this is largely driven based on resource availability. But as a general rule of thumb, think about it from a 1 to 2 square mile home range area that varies again and changes based on seasonality. But relative to the size of your parcel and or your management area and your goals and objectives, as well as the adjacency to other habitat types, are going to be important considerations when you're thinking about managing oaks. And so with that, shooting for diversity within your stands and thinking about, perhaps on a gradient, whether you're considering managing for oak forests with more close canopy type systems, oak woodlands, or oak openings and oak savannas, it might very likely dictate or alter the process and the types of management techniques that you may want to implement. So it's hard to talk about oak management without talking about the use of prescribed fire. Prescribed fire is an excellent management tool. It's something that is widely successful and when used with experts that can help facilitate these burns on tracks to ultimately help establish the desired composition within these forested stands. And so they're management tools for consideration, again, along that gradients of closed canopy forests to more open woodlands and savannas, and can help achieve your management goals in both the dormant and the growing season. So you've got options depending on what your individual objectives are for that specific stand. But one of the wonderful adaptations of a lot of our upland oak species is that they have relatively thick bark and have adapted to be able to withstand, in most cases, low to moderate intensity fires. So it makes them less susceptible to being as negatively impacted as other species to the effects of fire. But they also heal relatively quickly compared to other tree species, and sometimes can result in very limited discoloration of the wood itself. But a question and a consideration, certainly when considering managing your property, or if you're considering managing your property for merchantable timber, it's critically important to consult with an expert. Reach out and work with a certified forester as well as a biologist and discuss your options, discuss the desires to make sure everyone's on the same page. And if the monetary value and timber value is a primary concern or desire for the landowner or individual, then there's certainly ways to reduce the impacts to some of your more financially valuable trees while still meeting the management objectives for wildlife species. For instance, an example may be removing fuels from the base of a larger, more valuable white oak, for instance, helping reduce the flame length and the intensity at the base of the tree can help reduce the amount of scarring, and therefore having very little impact on the overall value of those oak trees. So from there, I wanted to shift into talking about these oak ecosystems from your closed canopy oak forests, and then shifting into more oak woodlands and savannas as we continue to open up the canopy, and the impacts that has on wild turkeys and how they utilize those different forest types. And then the importance of things to consider as examples. And then from there, I'd like to shift really quickly into showing some examples. I think there's several partners on this webinar and folks we've worked with collectively that'll probably recognize some of the examples that we've used on their properties or state or federal lands as examples that have been widely successful, and others that quite frankly haven't been, where we've continued to learn from some of those mistakes and improve our management techniques on those sites. But closed canopy forests, burning can provide some some benefits to the understory for your herbaceous vegetation, but it's going to largely be a little bit more limited. The opportunity for greatest improvement, for trying to promote a diversity of herbaceous vegetation at the base understory for these forest ecosystems is going to improve greatly if you open the canopy 20 to 30% to allow some of that sunlight to hit the forest floor. Certainly it's an important management tool, especially fire when coupled with other types of treatments. But it's going to be important to assess these on a stand by stand basis. Go through and inventory a stand, see what you have available out there, what sort of stand diversity you have, especially for your hard mast producers and your oaks. Understand that mass production is going to be cyclical. So what is that going to mean for your stand in terms of providing optimal benefits for wildlife and wild turkeys? And then it's important to think about it from the understory perspective beyond that herbaceous vegetation. Certainly it's a critical component for wild turkeys, and emphasizing the need for that, which I'll get into here in my next couple slides. The turkeys overwhelmingly don't like thick. They've got excellent eyesight, but when understories are inundated, for instance, with things like bush honeysuckle or autumn olive, they can essentially create these impenetrable areas that are of really, really low value for wild turkeys. And so, not to mention the suite of challenges that non-native and invasive species pose for area managers and biologists and foresters, et cetera. But thinking about that in terms of wild turkeys, they differ there from perhaps some other species that can withstand denser understories like white-tailed deer, for instance. So understanding that is an important consideration. And then determine what your goals are for these stands, and certainly on smaller parcels where you've got limited options, something like a crop tree release may be a good option, for instance, like with private landowners. So consider trees within the main canopy that have large crown, maybe a few dead branches within the upper crown. Again, your oaks, your hard mass producers are going to be highly preferred. Again, shoot for promoting species diversity and favor trees on some of your more productive sites that have produced in the past. So it can be an option to improve overall mass production and use for wild turkeys in some of our closed canopy oak forest ecosystems. And from there, we're shifting along that gradient and the change in that oak forest ecosystem type and moving into more open canopies. The ranges vary, but generally 40 to 65% in terms of canopy coverage for oak woodlands. And sunlight in this instance is key, and it's emphasizing the importance of that regeneration on the forest floor. And I've got that as my second point on the slide. Not forgetting to look down. Sometimes we get very focused on, what the overstory or mid-story might be. We're looking at even, the understory composition and things that are head height and roughly at eye level for some of us. But thinking about that bottom 2 to 3 feet, what's specific to management objectives for wild turkeys, what does that mean? Think about how a wild turkey hen or poults might traverse, throughout that woodland or oak forest site, and what that offers, what that site has available for wild turkeys. And in many cases, a combination of treatments are needed to reach the desired composition and canopy coverage to help aid in your herbaceous response. A diversity of native grasses and wildflowers that are going to support a whole wide array of insects that are critical for hens in the breeding season as well as poults. So this can be achieved again with a combination of mechanical treatment, timber sales, cutting, as well as prescribed fire. Prescribed fires is an important component, and to reach the desired conditions for some of these woodlands, thinking about incorporating prescribed fire on intervals of every 3 to 5 years has been shown in a lot of the research and literature is what's needed to maintain the higher quality nesting and brood habitat. And from there, we'll shift into more open areas near oak savanna habitat types. And these, quite frankly, are some of the coolest ecosystem types. I've had the pleasure to be able to help work with a whole wide array of partners on trying to restore some of our savannas in Southwest Michigan and parts of Indiana as well. And a lot of my counterparts across the country have had the opportunity to work in savannas, and they're really ideal brood habitat for wild turkeys. Phenomenal. But it's certainly an imperiled ecosystem type. 99.9% of oak savannas that existed prior to European settlement are no longer on the landscape. And so there's a lot of challenges that come with trying to restore oak savannas. So it's important in terms of trying to reach the desired canopy coverage, and some of the things that we've learned in helping support management on U.S. Forest Service grounds, for instance. That's where this photo was taken in Newaygo County in a partnership project that started in 2008, which I'll show a few more examples of here in the next couple of slides. But it's important to consider the amount and the percent of your prescription in terms of reducing the canopy coverage, knowing that you can go back in and conduct additional treatments, whether it's selective cut and herbicide treatment, if it's felling, girdling, certainly until you reach some of the desired composition, it can help to ease into to reaching that desired canopy coverage. And one of the challenges that we've seen specifically, if we open up some of these savannas too quickly and aren't able to follow it up with prescribed fire within a 2-year window, we see some of the inundation of species like Pennsylvania sedge, for instance, which can create sort of an impenetrable mat, makes it hard to really establish a diversity of wildflowers and native grasses in some of those instances. But if we ease into that treatment and slowly reduce that canopy to get it to that desired percentage, we start to see that we've had greater success in maintaining and reaching our herbaceous vegetation component for those units more quickly. So again, fire is going to be critical for management to reach the desired canopy coverage, but it's important to assess fuel loads following a timber harvest, for instance, mechanical treatment and removal, to ensure that you don't negatively affect some of the residual trees if you burn too quickly. But delaying prescribed fire following these treatments can also result in a response from less desirable woody species as well, creating a suite of challenges. So it's ever changing. It should be assessed on a case-by-case basis, and in often cases, a combination of treatments are really needed in order to reach the desired composition. But an important consideration for these units, and another thing we found successful before a shift, is considering later growing season burns to help set back the succession of those undesired woodied species, especially for the first few burns. And what I'm talking about is low to moderate fires with intensities and intervals of every couple of years will really kind of help meet that desired herbaceous composition until it's met. And especially if you've got a really viable seed bank. And in some cases, we haven't had that. So we'd gone in and interseeded some of these units and essentially have created small native savanna seed plots to act as more of an inoculation plot to help promote seed dispersal throughout some of these units. So I wanted to shift into a question I thought would maybe be important to cover. Something probably a lot of folks here on this webinar have gotten asked about in terms of management and the use of prescribed fire, especially as it pertains to the breeding season. We've got turkeys that may be actively nesting or thereafter, if they successfully reared that clutch and have a brood of turkeys, then what that means and what those impacts are for prescribed fire. And as many of you well know, there's a lot of benefits that can be associated with timing prescribed fire in the growing seasons, especially to help improve that diversity and response of forbs when compared to native warm season grasses that may be out competing some of your forb diversity, and also the impacts that it can have for setting back woody succession. But a lot of the literature that's out there specific to wild turkeys overwhelmingly shows that prescribed fire during the breeding season really has minimal impacts and rarely results in mortality. So there's a few things to keep in mind in terms of consideration. Certainly the extent and the frequency of fires, is one of the things to consider. And with any wildlife species and timing of prescribed firing techniques themselves are something that can be considered and incorporated within your burn plan to try and offset some potential impacts to other wildlife species if that's a concern for the unit. The scale of prescribed fire is another important consideration as a manager. Considering things like patchwork for burn areas to create rotations help offset some of those concerns. But an important note is that females, your hens, are highly mobile, as well as your poults, as old as 24 hours, have the ability to be able to move and avoid some of these areas, especially as you're going through a site prior to a burn. The likelihood that if a nest is hatched and that as you're surveying the area and making sure that the conditions are safe, the likelihood that you're going to push and move those individuals off of that site are pretty likely. And there, a lot of the research has also shown that poults will actively select sites that have recently been burned too. So the importance of prescribed fire in direct response and almost immediate response in terms of use of these areas is highly correlated. So another important consideration when talking about prescribed fire in turkeys within the breeding season is that wild turkeys have a high propensity for renesting. And so in the cases of failed nests, the opportunity for a female to re-nest is pretty likely, depending on the level of disturbance or a lost nest due to fire. So ultimately, in closing on this, the importance of prescribed fire and the benefits for it for turkeys during the breeding season, especially within the years following burns, is far outweighs the potential limited impacts on individuals. And most of the literature and research shows that it's had little effect on nesting turkeys, for instance. But turkeys also, had a lot of the literature, some of the more recent stuff that's come out in terms of the effects of prescribed fire. Within the last 3 years of a burn, turkeys have shown to select those burned areas within 3 years and nested in areas burned with 2 years prior to that nesting season. So again, the benefits and the impacts that you can have for positively improving the habitat in those areas with the use of prescribed fire are going to far outweigh any potential negative impacts, especially when you're considering all of those factors. So from there, I wanted to shift gears and highlight a little work that we've been doing in West and Southwest Michigan with oak savanna ecosystems. And this is a slide that I want to progress through that's got varying imagery dates to kind of emphasize in a way how we had went about working with U.S. Forest Service, and now totaling close to 40 partners have invested in this cooperative effort to help us restore these oak savanna ecosystems, not only on Forest Service lands now, but lands adjacent to it, to really try and achieve that landscape level impact. And the neat thing about this project is it started based on the focus of improving these savanna ecosystems for the federally endangered Karner blue butterfly. And on this black and white photo that I've got up, you can see that it looks like a small field opening almost in the northwest corner of the slide. And that was at the time one of the very few metapopulation areas, the sites for the Karner blue butterfly. And we recognized an opportunity to work with the Forest Service to help facilitate treatments, open up that canopy coverage, and promote that herbaceous understory response for the Karner blue butterfly, but also, most importantly from our perspective, was the wild turkey. So when you shift to the next slide, you can see that we had gone in, I guess, some of the darker areas, which were predominantly red pine, white pine, and then a mixture of white oak and northern red oak, but helped conduct a timber sale on that small unit to help produce some timber revenue that then we in turn could go back in and use to support what the Forest Service calls service work items. So habitat work that's going to promote these savanna ecosystems and help us restore these areas for Karner blue butterflies. And you'll see the square-like figures as we're starting to slowly ease into opening up the canopy to reach our desired coverage percentage. And then as we shifted into where we are now currently, you can see where we've reached our objectives, but we eased into trying to reach that desired canopy coverage a little bit more slowly. There are still some blocks, some square blocks within these units, and those were set there to essentially be able to show individuals that come to this site what the control is, or what these conditions look like due to the lack of disturbance to maintain these oak savanna ecosystems with multiple forms of disturbance, and especially fire. But we employed a variety of different treatments after following the timber harvest in these areas, and even created and developed some of those inoculation plots that I've mentioned previously. So with that, in closing, I just wanted to summarize for folks some of the takeaways when you're thinking specifically about managing some of these oak ecosystems for wild turkeys. And one, this is a plug that I'm going to let Michael, my partner from American Bird Conservancy, drive home and emphasize, as they're one of our primary partners and taking the lead in Indiana for us. But this is a part of a larger initiative and a cooperative of partnerships, emphasizing the importance of letting the sunshine in. It's a simple statement, and but it is exactly what it says. Working with partners on a project that started in Illinois, my counterpart John Burke and others there helped support this effort to recognize the importance of letting the sunshine in for these oak ecosystems and what that means. And so how to do it, there's multiple ways, of course, to be able to do this and let the sunshine in, and different treatment types in terms of directional felling, releases, individual mechanical, chemical, and mechanical treatments that could be employed depending on what your individual objectives are for those sites. And we've tried to implement a variety of different treatments and have examples on projects within my district. And this is an example of a hack and squirt treatment that we hired a contractor to facilitate in an oak forest on the Berry State Game Area and DNR owned managed lands, to try and assist with, again, letting that sunshine in and reducing the canopy coverage, trying to essentially treat some of those species that weren't viable or marketable timber, and the opportunity to be able to remove them mechanically through timber harvest wasn't an option. So we saw other methods to try and help open up that canopy, increase the amount of sunlight, and then help the agency thereafter facilitate the needed disturbance and burn prescribed fire intervals to reach those objectives and aid with the oak regeneration on that site. And again, think about the bottom 2 to 3 feet. As much as we collectively think about our oaks and the crowns and mass production, which is critically important and certainly a vital factor. When you're thinking about wild turkeys, it's important to think about what's at your bottom 2 to 3 feet. And this photo here, with a gobbler in it in the background, is sort of accentuates the importance of that. Try and think about these sites as it relates to wild turkeys, and especially the opportunity to be able to positively impact these forests and the impact that sunlight can have, and multiple treatments in a fairly regular interval of prescribed fire on these units for promoting this desired diversity of species is going to be important. Here's an example. I was out in late May on a project site, one of our savanna restoration sites, where we had a hen with 6 poults that were using this herbaceous understory with these forbs, wild lupin in this case, that poult is tucked in there and hiding in, but it created a wide array and essentially an insect magnet for these birds. And so shortly after hatch, they were utilizing these areas pretty heavily. So the importance of those smaller openings should be a consideration when thinking about managing for wild turkeys. And from there, the importance of diversity and structure, and how that relates to disturbance. There's multiple ways that we can mimic disturbance and incorporate fire to reach some of those management objectives. But the importance of small understory, mid-story structure within some of these units is also important. It's an important consideration from a nesting and brood rearing habitat component as well. Having low-level shrubs and soft mass producing shrubs, for instance, that can be utilized by hens with poults, especially as they begin to fledge after that first 7 to 10 day window, begin to develop and start hopping up on lower branches. Once young poults can reach that threshold past that 2-week window, their survivability increases tremendously. So if your goals and objectives are to help do what you can to promote and improve habitat for wild turkeys, thinking about it during that critical time period and providing that diversity and structure from the herbaceous standpoint, as well as the understory, it can really help go a long ways for those birds during that critical time period. And then lastly, consult with a professional. It wouldn't be possible for me to do what I do on a daily basis without the help of our partners, my counterparts. Like collectively, we've got a multitude of certified foresters and biologists across the country that I work with just within my organization. But rely really heavily on our partnerships with the Association of Conservation Districts, our partnership with our federal agencies, the NRCS, and their ability to help facilitate work on private lands. Our work in the Eastern United States is critically important for us to be able to do work on private lands, knowing that most of our forests, about 80% of them, are privately owned. So in order for us to really truly have the impact that we want across the landscape, especially as it pertains to wild turkeys, consulting with a professional is something we recommend to folks that reach out to me and others, and getting some perspective so you can determine what those management objectives are and what your options are to best impact your oak ecosystems. So with that, I wanted to thank all of our partners, certainly the support from the White Oak Initiative, and Mike Smulligan, Michigan DNR, and Michael Paling there, of course, who's going to present next from the American Bird Conservancy, huge partners of ours, and then to those that certainly helped promote and assist our efforts across the landscape in terms of improving oak ecosystems with the National Wild Turkey Federation. So with that, I wanted to leave it open for questions if there's time, Mike, or if we wanted to shift over to Michael, that's fine too. There's my contact information for folks that may want it. I'm happy to chat, and feel free to reach out at any point, and be happy to get you in contact with some of my counterparts if you're not from my district.
Hey, thank you, Ryan. Yeah, no, we've got 3 minutes for questions. I see we've got one question typed into the Q&A. Please use the Q&A window if you folks have any more questions. Let's see, let's get to this first one. So if white oaks produce acorns for upwards of 200 years, do we still have at least 100 more years to solve the oak recruitment problem? 95% of the timberland in Michigan is represented by forests in age classes less than 100 years old. Ryan, you want to take that one?
Sure. Yeah, I would say that, the time is now. The future is really in our hands to help facilitate that and initiate that change. Although, yeah, it can be viable mass producers on the landscape for a significant time period. The shift and the changes in these forest types due to a lack of disturbance certainly is going to create challenges in the future. So really, it's a long-term game, and I've always respected foresters for their ability to have that vision, to think into the future about their grandkids and how they may be able to utilize our forest ecosystem types. So it's important to consider that and incorporate the necessary management so these forest systems that can and should be maintained or managed for your oak hickory ecosystems, for instance, are needed to ensure that we've got that. These oaks are play such a vital role from a market standpoint, from an industry standpoint. Things like bourbon, for instance, in the multi-billion-dollar industry that is, using white oak staves, for instance, is just one example. Furniture, building supplies. There's multiple reasons and ways to consider the importance of oaks and the future of oak outside of just the wildlife value. So I would say, yeah, although they can be producers of mast for significant time periods, it's certainly not something that we can rely on. And the trends that we're seeing from this data from FIA, for instance, certainly warrants the need to try and intervene now to help curb that loss of and lack of regeneration.
Great, thanks, Ryan. We got a second question for you here. So we've got a question for the turkey guy about deer. So any advice that you would have for habitat managers who are battling high deer numbers that's causing excessive browsing and limiting oak regeneration?
Mike, we were trying to avoid the deer, weren't we? We didn't know.
Yeah.
No, that's a great question, and it's something certainly I can't begin to have all of the answers for. Certainly, what's legal and allowable for in terms of harvest and management can certainly help reduce deer densities. So again, working with a certified wildlife biologist and forester specific to that site, to assess the impacts of browse, I think would be the first step to assess that impact, and then talk about different treatment alternatives or what may be able to be employed in those instances to offset the impacts for over browse for oak regen.
Great. Got one last question for you here. Do you know of any resources for private landowners to conduct prescribed burns on their private lands? Anything in regards to, funding or advice?
Yeah, that's a great question, Ben. That's something that's going to vary state to state, depending on where you are specifically. One of the avenues that we've used to help facilitate prescribed fire on private lands, for instance, is state funding through a grant program, but through a cooperative effort and an agreement that we have with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Services Partners for Fish and Wildlife program. So the Fish and Wildlife Service will essentially, work with that landowner to develop an agreement for managing these habitats, and then we can come in and help provide funding and facilitate or contract the individual to conduct the prescribed fire on their land. So there's going to be a lot of variability in terms of challenges with liability for conducting prescribed fire on private landowners, but I know collectively we're involved in a lot of discussions to help improve opportunities for individuals to incorporate prescribed fire as a management tool on their lands. So it just depends on where you're at, but happy to discuss that with you further if you have questions, or if you're not within Michigan, Indiana, or Ohio, I can get you in contact with some of our experts in your area too.
Excellent. Well, Ryan, thank you very much. I think we're going to shift gears now to Michael Paling with the American Bird Conservancy. Thanks, Ryan.
Great presentation, Ryan. I thought that was very well done. So let me share my screen now. You guys are now seeing it in the non-presentation mode, right, Mike?
I'm seeing it in the slides mode. Go ahead and click on that presentation mode there. All right, rock and roll.
All
You're
good
in
now?
good shape. Everything looks good. Sounds good. Take it away, Michael.
All right. Well, I thought Ryan did a great job on that presentation. There is definitely going to be plenty of common topics, common points between our presentations talking about turkey habitat and then non-game bird, songbird habitat. So for anybody I have not met or does not know me, I am Michael Paling. I am a forester for American Bird Conservancy based out of Marquette, Michigan, way up in the Upper Peninsula. It's nice and snowy out today, but I have been with American Bird Conservancy for a couple years now, and one of my big roles with ABC is helping landowners try to manage their property for the little bird that you can see there on the screen, the golden winged warbler. So typically that's working with aspen and tag alder stands, so not necessarily oaks. But today we're going to focus on talking about oak habitat and a couple forest songbirds that primarily use oaks as their main habitat source. But first, I also like to kind of start off a quick introduction on who American Bird Conservancy is for anybody that might not know us just yet. We are also a nonprofit, just like the Wild Turkey Federation, and we are dedicated towards conserving wild birds and their habitats throughout the Americas. So both North and South America, the entire Western Hemisphere. We have staff members that are scattered throughout the entire US and a couple that are reside internationally as well. So in the Great Lakes, we have a staff members of about 11 or 12 people, and many of us are foresters that are again working with private landowners throughout Michigan, Wisconsin, and Minnesota. So if you are looking for more information, you can find us at abcbirds.org or just about any kind of social media site. And I also like to start off most of my presentations, just in case anybody is not familiar with what's been going on with birds in the past couple decades. Research recently has been showing that bird populations are declining across North America, that is. So since 1970, we've lost almost 3 billion birds, and a lot of those are that includes grasslands, forest birds. Waterfowl, on the other hand, has actually seen an increase in populations, which is largely due to conservation efforts that have been undergone the past couple of decades. So hopefully with conservation efforts that we do for forest songbirds and grassland birds as well, we can reverse the trend of the declining trend, kind of like the Kirtland's warbler story. We've taken several decades to reverse the decline of the endangered Kirtland's warbler to the point that we were able to delist it in 2019. So birds are on the negative decline, and we need to try and fix that. But what are some of those issues with these bird trends? And it's not an easy one thing. And you'll notice on this slide that most of these slides or most of these points don't have any specific thing for habitat impact, or I shouldn't say it's directly related to the habitat that we are working in. They are maybe indirectly working or related to habitat. But as you can see, some of these are not necessarily going to be points that we are able to control or make huge impacts on just through the management we are working on. But I always like to bring it up just so that you're a little bit aware on some of the problems and some of the things that could be issues with bird declines. But there is still problems with habitat when it comes to habitat loss and degradation. Land conversion, forest fragmentation, those are huge, huge problems when it comes to bird habitat. Without the suitable habitat on the landscape, it's not going to be conducive for bird populations during either the migratory seasons for stopover sites or for the breeding seasons in the spring and summer, or wintering grounds when they come and spend or even reside throughout the winter in our great state. Of course, there's also plenty of problems with invasive species as well. I've seen invasive species in many parts of the state, and I know we all probably have as well. And that goes beyond Michigan for anybody that is here and not residing in Michigan. we are probably all aware of the invasive species issues, and it's just a big problem for birds as well. Degradation in terms of nesting sites for birds, as well as food resources to be able to store up fat reserves and energy for making the long trek back to back during migration back south. And getting a little bit more into the topic of oaks, I wanted to bring up these couple maps here, and I'll quickly point out that these are not quite related maps. So the colors are not going to line up and the categories are slightly different. But these are maps of the forest types throughout Michigan. And what the map on the left that I want to point out is, I believe you guys can see my mouse now. But if you think about the southern area of Michigan, all this orange used to be a lot more oak habitat, including that oak savanna habitat that Ryan said that we've lost more than 99% of the oak savanna habitats. And if you compare that to the map on the right, which really shows the habitat fragmentation. So the blue on the map on the right would be that oak hickory type forest. And we can really see that the forest types have declined. It's converted to a lot more urban and agricultural land throughout the southern lower peninsula. So we can really see the difference in how much habitat we have really lost across time. But now birds need things, just like everybody needs things. I mean, when it comes to habitat, what does a bird need? And I always like to think, what do I need? Or what do you need? What do we need to survive? And it's sometimes pretty simple: food, water, shelter, and then places to raise a family. Sometimes it's just simple things, and forests or I should say, each bird is going to utilize forests and forest habitat or grassland habitat even in many different ways. So how are our oak forests providing that? We have shelter, shade, and mating sites. You've got food sources, acorns, as well as foraging sites for woodpeckers, for in wood-boring insects. Perch sites for singing during the spring. Nesting sites. We've got plenty of oak trees are great for providing cavities. They're also great for providing nest sites for smaller birds as well as larger birds. Birds such as the northern goshawk can really utilize those larger limbs to be able to provide stable footing for their larger nests. And then to have nests or stick nests or leaf nests, you've got to have some kind of material to be able to make it out of. And oak leaf litter is great at providing that material. And I mentioned food coming from oaks. It's not just acorns. A huge benefit to having oaks around is through caterpillars and insects. Oaks are very good at supporting insects on their throughout the bark, the buds, the leaves. According to the entomologist Doug Tallamy, 930 different species of caterpillars have been recorded on oak trees. that's a lot of different caterpillars. I didn't know there was even that many yet. And there's still many more, but of those 934, over half of those are found on white oaks alone. I think that makes these kind of a super tree in terms of the food sources it can provide, because it provides plenty of caterpillars, plus the acorns, plus any buds that might be good for browsing on. Lots of food sources come from oaks. And just to give a little bit of a perspective of how important these caterpillars are, I think we are all well, maybe not all of us, but black-capped chickadees, there's a lot of them, and they need about 80 to 90% of their diet is caterpillars. I think I remember hearing something along the lines of one baby black-capped chickadee during the spring breeding season would need over 7,000 caterpillars alone. That's quite a large amount of caterpillars needed. So oaks are a great source for it. And as I mentioned before too, a large part of my role with American Bird Conservancy is helping to create habitat that is very suitable for the golden winged warbler. Now, I mentioned that briefly that it primarily utilizes aspen forests or tag alder forests. And yes, that's fully true. What I wanted to point out with this slide here is we also want to utilize oaks in that work as well. So oaks residing within a mostly aspen forest can be useful. What we would be looking at doing is we want to create a very young shrubby habitat, and that's great coming from aspen forests where we can get thick densities of young aspen whips, but then we are also being able to retain those residual oaks behind, because those oaks would be great perch and singing sites for the golden winged warbler, as well as being able to provide those foraging sites for caterpillars. The golden winged warbler itself is primarily uh, a worm eater. I believe the Latin name vermivora, and I don't remember the last part, but I believe vermivora literally is in Latin, means worm eater. So having caterpillars, especially leaf rollers, is super important. The picture there on the bottom left of the screen can really, or shows the golden winged warbler trying to find food through a curled up leaf, most likely a leaf roller caterpillar. I found this map not too long ago, and I wanted to include it just because I thought it would also be really interesting to just talk about how widespread oaks are across the continent. And I know this is just a map of the US, but it's a good perspective of how many different oak species we have and how important it can be, not just in Michigan, but across the country. And we've got different oaks that reside on the eastern side of the country, as well as different oaks on the western side. And if you think about how many different bird species there are plenty of oak, plenty of birds that will be supported by these different oak forests all across the country. And with that, there's many different oak forest habitats. Ryan has covered several of them, especially the importance of oak savanna habitats as well. But I just want to point out some of the differences that some birds will how some birds will be utilizing some of these different forest types. And for how many bird species there are, I could go on for the next several months talking about how birds would utilize oak forests. But obviously, we only have another 20 minutes or so. So I'm going to focus on just the red-headed woodpecker here in the top middle, the cerulean warbler below that, and then the scarlet tanager down on the bottom right. And the pictures of oaks that I have here is to kind of display the difference between oak savannas, white oaks, and then red oak forests. Because some birds will be much more preferable for oak savannas, like the red-headed woodpecker, whereas others might not be, or might like more interior forests. So red oak interior forests will be utilized by a mixture of different forest bird species, just like white oaks will be. Now, if for most bird species, if they had the choice, they would prefer going towards white oaks over red oaks. And I believe part of that is along the part of that goes along with what Ryan was mentioning when he was discussing some differences between white oaks and red oak acorns. Acorns being, or white oak acorns being a little bit more palatable towards birds or towards wildlife, I should say, overall. And I'm just going to go a little bit more into detail about some of these, couple of these different bird species, just to give a little bit more information specifically about the bird. And so I'll start with the red-headed woodpecker. The red-headed woodpecker is much more, prefers that open forest oak savanna habitat, especially up here in our northern areas. I believe I saw some research that said further in southern habitat, they are a little bit more found in some more denser forest habitat types. But up in at least Michigan, we're more likely to see them in some open forests, open oak savannas, and even urban settings, urban park-like settings as well. And they're definitely cavity nesters. They really need a lot of dead wood to provide nesting sites for them throughout the breeding season. Food sources, lots of different seeds and insects, a lot of different varieties. And what I found really kind of interesting was they will take the seeds and hide them in crevices in bark. And if you think about how some large oak trees, how deep some of the crevices and furrows can be on the bark, there's a lot of hiding places for their seeds and their food. They'll also do that with just some wooden fence posts if there's plenty of cracks in it. So storing them for later for later food. And before that, let me back up. I thought it would be just nice to include a little bit of audio. So I hope you can hear this, Mike. If not, please let me know, but I'm going to hit play just to give you an idea of what it sounds like, what the bird sounds like. If I can get it to work. Okay, Mike, are you hearing it?
I cannot hear it.
Darn. I was
Turn
afraid
it up
this
a
is
little
going to
bit
be a
louder,
thing.
see if it works.
I don't know if there's a way for me to turn it up quite. I think it's just going to end up playing through my headset. So unfortunately,
Try unplugging your headset and try it one more time. Sorry, still can't hear it. Oh, you might want to put your headphones back on. We're losing your audio now, Michael.
We tried. I think it's a bust. I wasn't, I tried figuring out how it was going to work, but unfortunately, Zoom and presentations don't always go as planned. But kind of moving on, the red-headed woodpecker is seeing a pretty decent decline in its population to kind of contribute back to that 3 billion birds loss over the past since 1970s. And a lot of that has been due to the loss of dead wood in forest land and urban settings. So especially urban settings where it's much more of a hazard to have dead rotting wood in park settings or along roadsides. And also collisions with cars. I found this one kind of interesting, but being a more open along roadsides, forested openings along roadsides. I've even found some dead red-headed woodpeckers along the road before. So that one was kind of interesting to think about, having personal experience from it. But when you're out working in the woods, the best thing that you can do for maintaining or creating habitat for this bird is just create dead wood, standing wood, whether that is through girdling trees or making sure existing snags are protected during a timber harvest, or encouraging landowners to not cut all the dead wood that's in their forest property. I've been out with many private landowners that uh, were quite surprised when I told them, don't cut dead wood down, or don't cut it all down, because they were not aware of such the importance that dead wood provides to nature and to wildlife. So that's really the biggest thing for the red-headed woodpecker. But working to restore that oak savanna habitat that Ryan was showing would be really beneficial. And I think it would be awesome to take a look at some of those sites that Ryan was working at, just to see if there was any activity from red-headed woodpeckers, or what other bird activity has been happening out there other than just the wild turkey. The cerulean warbler. This one is quite a bit different in terms of what habitat it likes. The red-headed woodpecker is much more open habitat, where the cerulean warbler likes that interior, intact, contiguous forests that we can, and most of that interior forests really they like it to be oak forests, especially if it's white oak forests. When they are selecting their nest sites, they really nest high in the canopies. I think it goes along very well with the colors of the bird itself. Kind of a sky blue and white colors, matches the sky very well. But they like to choose white oaks, hickories, or black cherries as some of their more preferred trees. And I've also heard sugar maples as well, but they really like white oaks for sure. And they avoid red oaks and red maples. And where I was able to pull that info from, I don't remember, I didn't see anything that stated why they avoided those, but it was interesting to think that the cerulean warbler moves towards, or prefers nesting in white oaks but avoids red oaks. So it's just another one of those factors that points out the importance of white oak versus red oaks. Food sources. This is again another bird that likes to feed off insects and caterpillars. So again, points towards that importance of caterpillars towards being on oaks. Issues with this bird, loss of 73%. It has been a lot of talk for the cerulean warbler and how to prevent it from continuing to decline. There is even a best management practice that you can find to help you when managing oak forests, interior oak forests, I should say, to benefit this bird. And as I've mentioned before, big issue for the habitat loss with this bird is that forest fragmentation, along with short management rotations and loss of key species, key tree species, such as the white oak. So being able to protect sites that are already suitable for the cerulean warbler is going to be a main factor in managing or how to manage forest habitat with this bird in mind. And that can mean changing from the typical or traditional silviculture or in working towards longer rotations with uneven aged forest management, letting trees grow to a larger size, larger diameter. And I think a lot of this management for this bird kind of ties in nicely with one of the presenters from last month who was saying we need to let our trees and our forests grow longer. And I think this bird is saying the same thing. He wants larger trees, older trees, more complexity within the forest, and uh, being able to provide that is critical for it. And then the last bird I'll touch on is the scarlet tanager. And this bird is not in quite the same steep declines as the other birds that I mentioned. And I thought it would be interesting just to briefly touch on a bird that might not always get as much publicity when it isn't in as much critical need of habitat management. But it is a bird that utilizes a large variety of different forest types, but does still prefer oaks and oak forest type habitats or oak pine forest habitats. So dry sites. Dry sites is where you're more likely to find the scarlet tanager on. And I would it also is one that likes the large trees, just like the cerulean warbler, letting the trees get a little bit larger, being able to provide those large habitat, those large trees on the forest is important as well. And I found it interesting that the scarlet tanager prefers to nest on horizontal branches, just a little bit away from the trunk, with shading above but not below. And I don't remember specifically why the information said shading above but not below. One of my assumptions is being able to find mostly insects for food, being able to watch for food on the wing. And I wish I could have you guys hear the audio right now, because I think this one is interesting. For anybody that's not familiar with the sound of a scarlet tanager, it sounds like an American robin, but with a sore throat. So very easy to confuse the two. And if it was me, I would have a difficulty. If I heard it in the woods, I wouldn't know which one it would be.
Hey, Michael.
What's up?
I've been getting some input from participants that when you go to share your screen, there may be a feature there to share computer audio as well. If you really want to try to share some audio, play around with that share screen button there at the risk of messing up your presentation.
No, I think it might just be better to safe and say I tried, but it didn't work out, and keep going.
All right, sounds
If
good.
people
Rock and
really
roll.
want to know what these birds can sound like, uh, Google it. I'm trying to think of the website name right now, but you can easily find them online. So, but again, issues with this bird at least goes back to that forest fragmentation. Real problems arise from the loss of forests or the conversion of forests from forest habitat into other land uses. Breaking up our forest across the landscape is a major issue, and along with that commonly comes cowbird parasitism. If anybody is not familiar with the brown-headed cowbird, it is a bird that doesn't make its own nest, and it lays its eggs in the nest of another bird. And as that baby bird hatches from its eggs, it outcompetes the native babies in the new nest, and eventually will kill them off. So it's also a big problem. But for managing for the scarlet tanager, maintaining a largely intact forest across the landscape goes along the same lines of the cerulean warbler management, as well as many other birds. But also being able to log outside of the breeding season, if that is a possibility. I think being able to log or harvest timber outside of the breeding season will be really beneficial for a lot of birds while they're in our region during the summer and spring. And as I mentioned before, there are many different birds that we could cover and talk about. So I just kind of wanted to flash a slide that just shows a couple more birds that can be utilizing oak forests and how much of a diversity there really is in wildlife. We've Ryan covered several species that are not here on my list, and this is only a small snippet of the amount of birds that could really be utilizing oak forests. And just a couple more slides in my presentation, but one of the things I thought I would touch on is sometimes with that many birds to think about, and not even just birds, but that much wildlife and different wildlife species, um, sometimes it's hard to really think about how how do we manage the forest with everything in mind. Um, and it can be hard when we're thinking about one specific wildlife species getting us a little bit siloed in. But a couple points that I always like to make is make sure you're looking at the landscape. It goes back to that habitat fragmentation that I've been talking about. Look at the landscape. What is the local landscape like? Uh, what are local partners doing? Ryan has touched a little bit on partnerships, and I think I've heard many times that one of the key successes or reasons that ABC is a successful organization is because of partnerships. Without partnerships, we can't make nearly the impact. Without partnerships, we wouldn't have even this webinar series here. And being able to partner with people like Mike and Ryan are uh, a great way to have success across the landscape and be able to do more good habitat work at a larger scale. So if you're managing your property, try and see if you can work with your neighbors. If you're friendly with them, don't go snooping around their property. But if you know your neighbors, see if they're already doing good work and see if you can work together on it. At the stand level, I mentioned it a couple times, but larger trees. Having larger trees along the landscape is very greatly beneficial to wildlife. Goes along the lines of letting our trees grow a little bit longer, a little bit more than uh, we already do. And those large trees are going to have lots of opportunities to be able to uh, provide acorn production. Large trees, more acorn production, more food. Large trees are also able to support more caterpillars, more caterpillars, more food. And deadwood and cavities. Deadwood and cavities are very important. As we've mentioned before, the red-headed woodpecker is a great example of why we need those dead standing trees. And I always like to mention to consider the trade-offs too, because not every bird is going to benefit from the management that you are doing on the landscape. And one of the examples that I'll touch on is, as Ryan said, we can't really talk about oak management without prescribed fire. And considering the trade-offs, at least, of oak or a prescribed fire, after a prescribed fire, we are not going to have the understory that we did before. We're not going to have a dense shrub layer or leaf litter layer for a couple years at least, or at least 1 year. And ground nesting birds are not going to be favored in that regards. They need the thick leaf litter or the shrub layer. So ovenbird or the black-throated blue warbler are a couple good examples. But there have also been studies that have shown that ground foraging birds have actually increased afterwards, after a prescribed fire, likely due to the exposed seed bed, seeds being a little more easier to find, as well as a more park-like look, which is much more conducive for fly catching on the wing. So, and one bird that's great for, or a good example for fly catching, is the eastern peewee. I've seen some research that shows the eastern peewee has increased in population after prescribed burns. But with that, I've also seen some research that's saying that there is a big difference between the intensities of fires too, and I know that Ryan also briefly touched on it earlier. Low intensity fires are going to have larger impacts on the ground floor, the shrub layer, and it's not going to necessarily make a huge impact on a lot of canopy nester trees or nesting birds, such as the cerulean warbler. There's not a huge impact for low intensity fires, but if we had high intensity fires, and if it is implemented correctly, there is some suggestions that prescribed fire could even be beneficial to the cerulean warbler as well. So I believe I am getting close to running out of time, so I am going to keep going. I've just got 1 or 2 more slides, but as Ryan briefly mentioned, the Let the Sunshine In program or points, it is definitely important to be able to open up our forest canopies and let the sunshine in, being able to regenerate our oaks in sustainable manners. ABC is working in partnership with many, as I said before, many partners, and one of the Let the Sunshine In program started in Illinois, and the further has been expanded to Indiana in partnership as well. And Ryan might even have a little bit more information on this program than I do. I believe he's worked a little bit closer with some of the partners, but being able to regenerate our oak forests is just going to be a huge benefit, or a huge importance for forest songbirds. And then to end things off, just a couple key points that I have made many times throughout the presentation already. Looking at the landscape, looking all across the landscape at what's going on is going to be hugely important for breeding grounds, stopover sites as well during migration. And being able to prevent a fragmented landscape more than it already is is important. So also encouraging outside of the management that we do, but encouraging developers or agricultural farmers to try and consolidate the work that they do into one local area so that they are not further fragmenting and breaking up and converting forest land into other land uses. Retaining large trees in the landscape. Sometimes having just a couple large trees can really make a huge difference in the utilization of birds and bird habitat. And with this whole presentation or this webinar series promoting oaks, being able to increase the amount of oaks that we have on the landscape overall is just going to be beneficial for birds and bird species, especially, of course, the couple that I've mentioned today. But they're as our president at ABC, Mike Parr, would always say, if birds could thank you for the work that you do, they would. And the last one little bit that I'm going to mention here is one of the biggest problems with birds and bird habitat is actually in cats. ABC is a big proponent of keeping cats indoors. So my cat, my personal cat has been an indoor cat for 4 years. He was an outdoor cat before I learned about all the problems. So I encourage you to keep your cats indoors too. And then just a couple resources to finish things off. If you're not yet familiar or aware of our Forestry for Michigan Birds program, take a look at michiganaudubon.org. We've got a page on their website where you can find information, and that includes the 2 guides that you can see there on the screen. There's one for managers as well as one for landowners. So, and if you have any questions about the program or information that's included in the guides, feel free to give me a shout and I'm happy to talk about it. And a couple other resources is looking into the Upper Mississippi Great Lakes joint venture. There are, and it goes back to that partnership efforts. And then most birds, not most birds, but a lot of birds do have best management practices that are geared towards themselves. So the cerulean warbler is one example. As I've mentioned today, a lot of the information came from the best management practices guides. So great resources, as well as the Birds of the World accounts as well. If anybody is not familiar with Birds of the World, I use this all the time. It is a resource of consolidated research where that accounts for, I don't know how many birds. I'm sure every bird that has research information on it, but it is very well in-depth consolidated information. And then for anybody that is not great at bird identification, Merlin is a great app to help you, a phone app that is great for new birders learning to identify by sight and by sound. And you can also go and find those recordings that I tried to play today, and you can listen to it on Merlin. But that is all I've got today. So thank you everybody for joining us.
Well, thank you, Michael. We've got 3 questions here. We'll try to knock out in 2 minutes. First one, are there any birds that eat spongy moth?
I know that there are birds. I can't remember off the top of my head. I do also remember that there are some birds that don't prefer it. There are more preferable caterpillars, mainly because of the hairs that are on the caterpillar. I wish I could remember what specific bird species would eat spongy moth, because we need more of them in Michigan.
Excellent. All right. Second question. How is ABC promoting old unfragmented forests for these species of interest that prefer those older forests?
I don't think I would be the perfect person to be able to answer that question. We do have the ABC staff with the make sure I'm giving you the right organization, the Appalachian Mountains Joint Venture, the AMJV, the Appalachian Mountains Joint Venture would be more suitable, I think, for providing that information. Especially my role is much more along the lines of the young forest habitat for the golden winged warbler. They might be more suited to answer the question.
Okay, thanks. And then a question regarding dead ash trees, as we have littered throughout Michigan. What do you have suggestions regarding dead ash? Leave them stand until they fall, plant white oaks? Would you be concerned about, falling ash trees damaging oaks?
Falling ash trees damaging oaks. My main concern would be whether there is the potential for infection, especially from oak wilt nearby. That would be one of my main concerns. I know that with the prevalence of the emerald ash borer and dead ash trees, there's been definitely an increase in activity from woodpeckers. I believe the pileated woodpecker for sure. But I don't know if I have a lot of advice for oaks, or not oaks, ash. With ash, it's going to be there's a danger in being able to take down dead ash if it's been dead long enough and rotted enough. So sometimes it's a better option to leave it standing unless you're able to harvest it or cut it down and use it safely. But being able to plant underneath it, if there's not regeneration coming back, being able to plant forests or tree species that are going to survive and in the conditions that are remaining after the ash trees have all died, that would be kind of where I would start on what trees you would choose, whether that's white oak or swamp white oak, or whether they can live would be the first thing I'd think about.
Great. All right. Well, sounds good. Well, Michael, thank you very much for your presentation. Ryan, thank you as well for presenting. We're out of time and we're going to have to wrap it up for the day. But thank you very much, everyone that joined us. I will download the attendance records and get those uploaded to Society of American Foresters for the folks that are looking for the 1.5 CFEs. Thank you so much, everyone. Have a great afternoon.
Thanks, Mike.
Thanks, guys. Thanks, everyone.